I look at Atmos in a way that I'm not trying to make it a gimmick. It's not just about making things crazy, about making things fly around the room. You've been given the gift of perception. My name's Hugh Neal. I'm an audio engineer and mix engineer at the Friary Studios based in Milton Keynes, just outside of London. We sort of kind of specialise in analogue recording. We've got Studio A and B, and this is the specialist Dolby Atmos studio. So where we've got the nice full-on 7.1.4 setup for us to do fully immersive mixing. I actually started as a musician, guitarist and singer, and that's actually how I met the owner of the Friary, Chris, who's a bass player. And it's around sort of kind of halfway through sort of my musical career that it was the touring and stuff started to become a bit more long-winded, and I was kind of, the unreliability of that was starting to get a bit on my nerves. So I thought, if I could get back into studio stuff. I'd always studied music technology and recording and had a passion for it, and that was around about 2012, I think. And it just coincided with the same time that Chris, or Freemonk as his producer's name known, was looking to get more into production. So I was like, I want to engineer more and mix more, you want to produce more, and engineer said, great, we can work together. And that's kind of really where it stemmed, and we're now 12 years on and still cracking on. Did a bunch of masterclasses, which was quite good fun, with people like Chad Smith, Ian Pace. Recorded an album with James McCartney, with Paul McCartney, which was quite good fun. There's some nice studio stuff going on, and it's nice to sort of kind of get involved in projects and go places. I've been fortunate, I've played on like the Letterman show in the US. I think the highlight is knowing that I don't have to do anything that's not necessarily what I want to do. That's quite a nice place to be. Because I was always working in music as a player, so I was always on the opposite side of the glass. Fortunately, worked with people like Youth, David Kahne, a few different kind of engineers, producers, guys that sort of kind of, you end up in the studio, you're like, oh yeah, cool, I'm here, but I'm just playing. So I was observing, sort of paying attention to them, and I just moved from being a musician to going, right, I already have a good contact list. Now I'm just going to go onto the opposite side of that and now be on this side of the glass. It's a bit of a weird one, whereas the normal sort of run would be go to a studio, kind of be an apprentice essentially, and assist and do things and build your way up from that. This was all done a little bit differently, so it's a lot of mistakes and learning curves, I suppose is the best way to put it. I try to always think, what would I do, as opposed to what does everybody else do. So, for example, if we took a rock track or something, we go, okay, well, the stereotypical idea here is to pan in a certain way, potentially, drums to sound a certain way, folk will be the sort of thing. They'll have like a specific sort of approach, which will be very quote-unquote that style. I just, for me personally, look at that and go, well, I just wouldn't do that because I want to be slightly different to that. One of my sort of kind of hero engineers, I suppose, would be Andrew Sheps. It's kind of like the way he thinks and how he does stuff resonated with me really well, because it's how I was approaching it. And for him, he's that sort of idea of approaching a pop record like a punk record. Or musically, I found this is, as soon as you put yourself into a pigeonhole, like, we're going to make an acoustic record, so everything has to be acoustic, you sometimes lose ideas because you're limiting your possibility. So yeah, genre-wise, anything and everything. Bear in mind, I think Atmos came out in 2012. I think the first functions in film, I think Brave was the first film to have Atmos. And it's like a perfect storm, because if you think about the fact that how much we utilise our phones and mobiles, how much we utilise streaming. Now we have 5G, we have all the streaming capability. Data isn't something you worry about so much now on phones to a certain extent. I think that then led to the possibility of Atmos being a very seamless thing. Around 2021, I think, when there was the kind of introduction to the Atmos music was becoming more prevalent. So a few engineer friends and stuff were being more inquisitive about the medium, because they were being requested, can you do an Atmos version, and so on. So there was a little bit of research into it, just primarily as a mix engineer in stereo. And I'm always one of these sort of individuals that it's kind of tackle the problem head on and understand it. Then you can then start to make any sort of kind of plans of action. It's a chap over in Los Angeles, a guy called Karma Orga, him and his partner, a musical partner, they set up a studio, and he was doing an article on it very early on, and I read that, and I've met that guy when I was playing over in the US, and I was like, oh wow, because he's a really sort of on it individual with sonics and so on. I was like, oh man, that's someone I would listen to. Realise that it's not as scary as everyone assumes. We had this space ready. We'd originally intended it to be a small sort of production stereo mixing environment. There was going to be a booth and some setups and stuff. Basically like a small secondary room that you could continue working on when A was busy. Checked out the specs, spoke to Dolby. They gave us the Dart, which is the setup of where we should put speakers and distances, etc., based on the size of what we've got. I had the idea, I thought instead of putting them on stands, we'll actually build the room to accommodate the speakers. So they're all obviously soffit mounted and so on. So we then just thought, well, if we're doing it, we may as well do it properly. I hadn't actually listened to any Atmos stuff until I actually sat down in the room and listened to it, which was a bit of a risk, I'm not going to lie. But for me, that comes back to this idea of not having any sort of kind of bias or thought process. I listen to it and go, right, this medium is either going to blow me away or it's not. And I listened and I was like, wow. This is mega. This is way, way different to what I was expecting. So I was quite impressed, really. And I would expect it over the next few years to boom. When we work with Atmos, we don't know what the end user is going to be. The predominant function of the ADM file, so that's the Atmos audio file, essentially has our different formats embedded into it. So for example, if I'm in a car and I have a 7.14, so 7 surround, 4 above, 1 sub, the file will play back in 7.1.4. Now I can get out of my car, I could go into the kitchen and have a Google, Amazon, whatever, one of these sort of units, as sort of Alexa or something like that, and it might play back in 3.1. So the two things that we definitely have to, or are advisable to check, is how it sounds on speakers and how it sounds on headphones. Because the predominant user experience, I would at the moment imagine, will be in headphones. And a headphone mix for us goes down to the binaural stereo file. So that's then where they imprint the metadata off, near, mid and far. So we can take an object and it will then sort of kind of work in the same way that the binaural information of our head works. So I always have to check on headphones. I always do. So you could, in theory, from a real pure basics, mix with just a good set of headphones. But the general format of your speaker system, if you're going to do this, let's say if you were to do an Atmos setup, but it wasn't to be a, say, quote unquote Dolby certified room, you still have to conform to the functionality. So on the Atmos system, the square will basically be at left, right, high, rear, high. The sides should be just behind us, and then the rears should be in the same line as the heights. And the idea is, whatever our width of square, so these are 2.4, 2.4, 2.4, 2.4, not quite here, we're about 2.3, but the speakers are then half of that. So these are at 1.20 meters to my ear. So the idea is then I'm sat, when I'm in mixed position, sat inside that box. Now from a mix point of view, that's relative because obviously I'm able to identify where the sounds and stuff are, and I can create the best sort of kind of possible picture. From an end user, we don't know where you're going to be. So yeah, so if you've got the idea of the square position being, we're in the sort of center of the box, so we'd have our kind of left, right, center as the triangle. The sides are just behind us to give us more of a side perception, because again, if it's being directly there, we would associate that with being in the part of the front left. In fact, when you have a 916 or a 914 system, you'll have super wide. But that's just for monitoring. I think most of the fold downs are always 714. So that's just for your extra benefit if you wanted it. The idea then is, of course, from a listening position, it's like when you mix in stereo, you sit in the middle. We don't sort of mix in stereo, sort of looking sideways to the speakers or off kilter. So you try and set everything up to give you that best balance, but the end listener's not going to do that. If you're sitting in a car, you're not listening to stereo in the correct way. You're listening to it immediately to the right. In fact, I know a mix engineer who has the same disdain for hi-hats as Albini did. and he'll mix the drum kit as a listener, but puts the hi-hats really, really far left. And that's because he doesn't want to hear them in a car. I think that's brilliant. I absolutely love that. But again, when you're looking at art or music, go back to what I said initially, is we're just trying to convey that recipe. We're trying to convey that message, that intent. It's not about me making it sound like you're watching a band. It's not about like, oh, well, if you stand over here, you're not going to understand the song. So if I watch a film, I will initially like the film. Then I'll start appreciating cinematography. What an amazing script. How good is the acting? But initially you go, that's a great concept of a film. You enjoyed the film, and you might watch it 2, 3, 4, 5 times. And now you start to dig into those things. You don't immediately go, oh, wow, look at that editing. Whereas editors do. So again, going back to this kind of idea of placement, because I think one of the questions everyone would be like, is how important is it? Is it really that important? It's like, how important really is it to make sure that you set your speakers up within that equilateral triangle position? If they're too wide, you'll have a thin centre, so you'll adjust your mixes according. If it's too close, you'll do the same thing. Now, of course, it's translation, so I can then start listening to my tracks and listening to my mixes and saying, oh, wow, the vocals are a bit loud, aren't they? So I will adjust according to my room. Now, I could, of course, adjust the speakers and then not have that problem, which is the ideal solution. So this has been set out in these degrees with these setups and distances and so on to give you the best translation of how that medium works. But you can always reference back to your headphones and find the balance. How many times, ask yourself this question, you listen to a piece of music and go, song's great, mix is terrible. It's usually the song's great, oh, I would have liked to have had more of this or more of that. That's just my opinion. It's very rare that you go, the song is a horrendous song and I'm listening to this terrible song, but the mix is fabulous. Because it's almost like it's like, not irrelevant, but it's kind of one of those things that we think a bit too much about having perfect environments and stuff that make everything, again, you miss the kind of point. But this sort of leading forward with an Atmos scenario, it is an undertaking to put a system in like this because you are experiencing an inordinate amount of speakers and you need the space and environment because, of course, if you have a smaller room, you can't get the distance particularly right with the rears, so then you have an overbalance potentially on the rear. But if you're aware of it, just then check it. Like that's kind of hopefully why then places like this would make sense, because you can utilize that check. So you have bed approach. So that's the kind of more of like your classic 5.1, 7.1 sort of kind of idea. So it's like each speaker represents a bed. And then we have like the idea of percentages essentially via pan, which is fine and it works. And I think that translates very well to system. So if we were to do a 7.1 to 7.1 and so forth. But I always felt that the fold down seemed to be a little bit odd. Again, this was some of the problems that were occurring very early on with spatial audio and the binaural, because the binaural metadata was just being ignored in spatial. So you were kind of doing a bit of a half-half mix. Once that got cleared up, so now it's totally sweet, you can really kind of just work with object-based mixing. Object-based mixing gives me effectively 128, well, actually it's 118 objects we can use because the first 10 are taken up with our beds. And that means any audio I can assign to an object which can exist within the three-dimensional realm. And that object can move, it can be altered in size. The third approach would be then to sort of combine the concept of beds and objects in a uniformed format. And I first came across this through watching Andrew Sheps. What you're doing is you're creating an auxiliary channel in your DAW, which is acting as a 7.0, 0.2 or 4 or so on. The 0.1 I'll leave as a separate auxiliary, which I'm feeding directly to the LFE, because I can then control the EQ curve on it. So it's 150 off, nothing above that. So it's that's a very specific prerequisite, but it means that because I'm not dealing with it on the channel itself, I can feed elements to that LFE and control that LFE very clearly in my Atmos render. So it should be just a supportive thing, because sometimes, again, I used it originally first off where it was part of the pan. It becomes really complicated and trying to figure out where things are, and because it could be set to pre or post, it becomes a bit of a nightmare. But the idea of the mixed bus objects set out like a bed means that I can have my 7.0.4. I then set out the relevant objects. So I do an object for left, an object for right, an object for centre, side left, side right, rear, so forth. So I say I had 4 backing vocals. I can assign that backing vocal to mix bus and just use the pan of that, which is an XYZ axis. So I can say, okay, this backing vocal is going to go to the left, but slightly high. So I'll then have a bit of sound going to object over here and a bit of sound going to that object there, but nothing really over to there, for example. And I could then get the next BV and pan it to there and the next one to that object and so on. So what I have then is it's firing through to a bus, which you can process. And I've actually got software versions of my hardware processing. So I can actually get a similarity to that should I require it. And that's then feeding to these objects, which are then in turn feeding to the render. If you're taking a stereo audio file and doing an Atmos version of that stereo audio file, we have to try and match up, well, we don't have to, we do have to explicitly match up length. So it needs to start at the same point as the stereo, and it has to end at the same point. Now, there's a piece of software called the assembler, which I created for this function, so if we can chop the end off and make it more accurate. But the idea with that is, if I need to create a limiting sound or some EQ or something, I can do this with my bus processing, and it's going out to my objects, so I'm getting an Atmos version, but in a sort of stereo format way. I now like to utilise that format as well as just pure object-based mixing, because the pure object-based mixing has a much better chance of folding down. I can input binaural metadata to those objects. So near being as in it feels like it's close to me. It's not a reverb, it's like giving you the same sensation of space. So it's like, for example, the distance from me to you would be essentially like a mid distance. And it's the same for then far and so on. So I can imprint this data, I can have off, which is like basically in your brain. That's only translated to the stereo binaural on headphone. But because I can imprint that data on it, I have more control over the sound. So if I then take 100 objects, I can have all this various metadata onto it. So of course it's a much more detailed potential stereo. And it won't be too dissimilar to me having just the basic object / id place of bed mix, if that makes sense. Now, if we were to take most of how we listen to music, predominantly that's going to be based within our sides, sort of left, right, bit of centre, and maybe the front, left and right high, because that's kind of how I visually see stuff and how I perceive things as a human. But I am aware of things that exist behind me and above and so on. So what I tend to do is I'll do any of that real fundamental stuff. We'll go through that bus going into the objects set out as like beds, reverbs, for example. I can insert a piece of gear into the software realm. So for example, I use a reverb, so I'll use these old lexicons. I can then fire that back into here, use a plugin, in this case the upmixer, so Nugent upmixer, which I can then fire down to my mix bus, which is then sending that reverb out to this space. So I can have predominantly here, but some sides and rears of this reverb. So if you sing a note, you'll get this back. Delays are cool like that. So you can have it fire back and stuff. Now that's what I would use to create like an atmospheric, but I might have like the guitar's still here and the drums are here and the vocals are here. I look at Atmos in a way that I'm not trying to make it a gimmick. It's you've been given the gift of perception. So if you think about stereo in normal terms into speaker systems, it is a bit kind of wacky if you think about it. Stereo technically is there's one of me over there and there's one of me over there, and we're both talking at the same time, and you then fill in the blanks and say I'm here. And that still happens in the way that Atmos. We do have the opportunity of centre speaker, but you wouldn't necessarily pan to centre, because then in the binaural it can sound a bit nuts because that doesn't exist because we've gone back to the phantom. So it's having this consideration of all these different possibilities. And that's what I think puts people off a little bit, because they look at that and go, hold on, this is just crazy. Why have we got all this? Like, don't worry about it too much, because it's just, if it sounds good and you can perceive it, it makes sense. It's like you don't have to put something in the centre. I can still just do, like, one of the things that I tend to do is I still have the vocal in left and right, but we'll use this functionality where you can sort of kind of start to pan. It's called divergence, which allows me to pan to give you an illusion of this. So I am putting a little bit of sound in there, very small, but when it gets to the binaural, it makes more sense. So it's kind of having those sort of options. It is a little bit more complicated in the sense of you just got more things to think about, more things to look after. But the advantage is you have dynamics back. The ability for you to play stuff in the space and make it sound impactful is a lot easier, in my opinion. Like the volume, the impact, everything about it was just like, oh, it's just it's got more summit about it. So I've had to I'm like, oh, how am I going to pull that back to make it seem a little bit more like the stereo, because it's going to make the stereo sound weak. But all the same principles apply. All your mixing techniques from stereo are all, I believe are similar in that functionality. It's not like that's gone out the window. It's just we've just got more space, and I just have to keep an eye on some headroom, really, at the end of the day. But it's that object-based versions. And like I said, if you wanted to understand more about the mix bus going into the objects, that's the thing that Sheps was talking about. That was kind of a really kind of interesting and functional approach to it. I quite like that. When I first was embarking into it, there was nothing. So it's a case of you get a problem, you Google it, and it's just a blank page. And you're like, brutal. So I was fortunate that a couple of friends, I've got a friend of mine, Ollie Morgan in Abbey Road, who was started up with this stuff, and he was doing some Atmos. So I was chatting to him about some of these bits. Occasional sort of bounces back with some of the guys from Dolby, but predominantly it was just me and a book. There was a couple of there are quite a lot of videos of people talking about mixing in Atmos. So Dolby had done some really good videos of people using headphones and stuff, and there was a few things of people setting up things and going through processes. So it wasn't like there was completely nothing out there. That was definitely not the case. But in terms of sort of kind of convention standards and so forth, there wasn't really a great deal of anything as of yet, because of course everyone's kind of finding their feet. That video from Sheps was really handy because it's kind of listening to those approaches and how somebody's thinking about it in the same sort of way, in a similar way to your mixing standards of how you do it. Because everyone has their own workflow, so I suppose. There's no right or wrong way of doing things. It's just whatever you find is effective and whatever works. The mixing stage was more about me identifying how to control the audio in a way that is something that's relatable to me. The move from just using the bed to object bed to then just purely object, and then going, no, actually it's better if I use these two things together because I get a bit of both. But I think what happens with a lot of people with software is if you're used to being a little bit more analog format, like I started on 4 tracks. Now, as soon as I started to go into the computer realm, and obviously everything expands, you then start to get used to that. So for me, don't mind being in the computer. So I'm quite happy with 160 plus channels on a mix. It doesn't affect me because it's just scanning through and working. And I think a lot of younger, more up and kind of coming through the systems are just used to that. They're used to large track counts. It's not a big thing for them. So that's where I think you're going to start to see this organisation functionality. It's just being disciplined within that, I think, will help you to control your mixing and control how you would apply a lot of this stuff in the kind of Atmos realm. It's a bit like predicting curves in fashion, which obviously I'm great at. I think it's a little bit like trying to identify what I think consumers will be used to. The first initial instinctive reaction to something like Dolby is like, which everyone does, oh, it's surround sound. Now, why did that not really take off? It was a very specific thing. So it'd be like, oh, it's a gig, it's a this, it's a that. But that's because you would have had to have done separate mixes of every single format. So 5.1, 4.1, 3.0, all this sort of stuff. My initial thought was, well, how is that going to be possible for the consumer? Because if I've got to buy like a new set of headphones, or I've got to buy an amplifier or something that will allow me to listen to that, then that's ridiculous. Like, the consumer will vote with their feet essentially, and stereo will be king once more. But once I started to realise, actually, the consumer doesn't have to do a thing. Like, an artist doesn't have to massively concern themselves about it. It baffles me that they're not more interested in it, Because from my perspective, when I was writing and playing, one of the things that always used to kind of annoy me was the fact that I couldn't always get enough space for the things I wanted to say. Here we have it. Like, I can literally make all this stuff. The way that you can convey a story through music is phenomenal in Atmos, because you have that ability to make it very airy, washy, completely then, like, from 1 second in, it's just like, shum, here, because it's so easy to make it work like that. And not in this sort of kind of cinematic format, but just in emotional. If I look at it now, at present moment, who's a 20-something-year-old artist in the industry, these people grew up 5 years ago with Spotify. They grew up with stereo, and they grew up with iPhones at the sort of relatively sort of kind of, not rudimentary, but relatively sort of kind of start developments of what that is. It's not like it was where it is now. You can exist like that, but everybody else has already moved on. And I think this is going to be the same thing. Stereo is amazing. There are amazing records and things that are done in stereo sound incredible, and we can't say that that's a dead medium. It isn't. It's never going to be obsolete. The people who said that also said that about CD, cassette tape and vinyl. All still exist very happily. Is it the same as it used to be in the CD? No, okay, it's not. But streaming's had that knock-on effect. It's not the medium per se. So we've moved on from that and accepted it. It's fine. So I think with this, the future for me, it's not who's in the next year. It's in the next 5 years, 6 years. I can just imagine as a young kind of adult learning about music technology and music and wanting to create and wanting to do something themselves, being put in a position where you have a platform that you can use on your iPad that's not busting the bank, and you can then Atmos it, and all you need is a set of headphones and off you go, and you're given full creative three-dimensional range, that they would not embrace that and would not expect it as a normality when they're in their 20s. I just believe the medium itself is so beneficial to music as a whole. I can't see why we would have any problem with it. And that's not me buying into it. I'm not endorsed by anybody. I'm not, oh, you must do this because this is going to benefit me in any way, shape. I couldn't care less if you're into it or not. I just think that it's so good. Even and it's not just about making things crazy, about making things fly around the room. Being in the live environment, there's a different energy, there's a different presence that comes across, but it's very, very similar to the sensations audibly that I get from that. And when I've played stuff with that mindset in, that I've mixed for people, that's what they get. They go, oh wow, that's like watching it, or that's like being in the room. And I'm like, yeah, exactly. For me, Atmos enables the engineer to deliver that in the right way, and it allows the artist to present that. So I just don't understand why somebody would go, you've got this option, you can make it work to exact standards, but you're choosing that you don't want to do that through just fear. It's the same. It's like a knee-jerk reaction. It's rubbish. No, I don't want anything to do with it. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be complicated. It's not. It's a relatively straightforward thing. It's like once anything's complicated, walking's pretty hard, you know. It's like initially, but we sort it out, you know. So even if I stopped working in Atmos tomorrow, I would be sad if it wasn't a thing. I think we would be missing something. I was looking for some, some near field sort of setups, and I ended up getting a set of the passive BM5s. Working with those for a bit, and I then was really into the idea of the 15s, the actives, the BM15s. In the main studio, we've got the M4s and Monroe M4s, which were a collaboration with Dynaudio, so there's a lot of the stuff are in there, a Dynaudio as well. So I've always loved the 15s, did some mixing with those, and we predominantly use them in Studio A. So when the opportunity came up for speakers for here, because it was a complete shift, because I'm not only going into a new location for mixing, but I'm also going into a new medium for mixing, I wasn't so worried about keeping with the same system. So I was quite open to the idea of not staying with someone like Focal or something like that and moving along. So we looked at some of the options and looked at things that were going on, and the Dynaudios were a good match. So again, when we do our the report or Dolby give you what your spec of your room. They go, okay, this is what your room size dictates. This is what we think the speaker systems that you should, this is the minimum option, this is like maximum option, these are different makes. So they give us a list of things that we could go, and these were on the system. So having some looked into it, we then went down with the Core system. So this is the newer professional sort of kind of studio speaker system. Because again, Dynaudio have been doing high fidelity stuff and it's phenomenal speakers. We ended up going with the Core. So we've got Core 7s for the highs, sides and rears. At the front we have Core 47s for left, right and centre. And then 2 Core subs to make up the spec for the Dolby certification. I knew I was going to be happy with them because Dynaudio, I know a bunch of guys who use the different systems from the older sort of ranges, and they've all just sang praises about Dynaudio. They're very detailed, they sound incredible, there's no distortion, you can drive them, they're bloody loud, you know, they go really, you know, that you never seems to, but they're not fatiguing at loud. So it's something that I noticed with the M4s as well, which is again predominantly Dynaudio. They seem to have this uncanny ability to be able to pump out extreme dB volume and it feel comfortable. And for something like the Atmos, that's really important because we don't have that ability to over compress to give that perception of volume. Sometimes we actually need some volume to move some air so I can get an impression of it. So it's nice to have that space on it. I think the fact that it's especially the 47s, it's the 3-way system, you know, it's Class D amplifiers, so it's like it's super high end. It just sounds incredible. They just sound kick-ass. If these were the only speakers I had for the rest of my life, I would not be upset about that.